All right. Good to see Brother Shulong was able to join us. And Zhangshan, good evening. It's good to see you as well. Okay. Let's see. Zoom has changed the format here, so I'm trying to get used to the new. They're always wanting to update software. Okay, I think I got it figured out here. All right. Well, it's been a few weeks since we've been able to gather, so we're gonna jump right back in looking at poetry together. And we focused our attention, moved towards just doing the poetic analysis step now. That's been what we focused on the last few sessions. And if you remember, the steps for poetic analysis are these 5. We looked at the first 2 in the last couple of sessions. Again, our focus is now just looking at the poem itself. And so we want to do the reading and observation. And then last session, we looked at identifying the setting and the structure of the poem. So we want to understand the background of the particular poem. Who wrote it? What kind of a poem is it? Can we identify the structure, the stanzas? And so we spent time looking at that. The next step in poetic analysis, we're going to go back to something that we learned, I think, near the beginning when we started talking about Hebrew poetry, and that is parallelism. That's one of the elements, if you'll remember, in Hebrew poetry that is kind of unique in that parallelism is essentially looking at how each line of the poem, how each line relates to the lines around it. And really, we're looking at, in this case, parallelism is examining each verse. And if you remember, each verse is set up in the form of either couplets, 2 lines, or sometimes 3 lines, and even 4 lines at times. And those lines within each verse are connected to each other in some way. They have a particular relationship with each other. So if we looked at a couple examples here, if we look at Psalm 1, for example, how blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. Those lines are related to each other. There's a parallelism to them. They're interconnected in some way. It's verse 2, his delight is in the law of the Lord. In his law, he meditates day and night. And those have a relationship with each other. And what we've noticed with Hebrew poetry is this interconnection between the lines of a poem. And we looked at several types of parallelism. If I can, I've got it here on the right. If you guys will remember, the different types of parallelism that we have looked at before is synonymous parallelism, which is where the second line essentially repeats the first line using synonyms, but it almost matches exactly in what the statement is. That's very, very common, probably the most common type of parallelism. Then there's probably the second most common is the contrastive. And that's where the second line is a contrast to the first. For example, in that particular psalm, right, the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So there's a contrast being presented there. Then the third category or third type of parallelism, and this one's a little more challenging, is called developmental. And that is where one line is developing the other line, either adding more information to it, either being explaining or illustrating it, or sometimes the next line gives the reason or result of the first. And so that's developmental is also common in parallelism. Then there are times where parallelism is not obvious, so it's just unknown. We're not sure what it is. And there's a special kind of parallelism in synonymous or contrastive passages called a chiasm, where the second line is in reverse order compared to the first. And we when we studied this before, Psalm 51 was a particular psalm that used a lot of these chiasms, and where essentially the second line is synonymous or contrast the first, but it's in the opposite order. So instead of a subject, verb, object, it would be an object, verb, subject, or something like that. And that draws attention to the center of that chiasm, where the end of the first line or the beginning of the second line. And I can remind us of one example of that from Psalm 51, just to review. Let's see. Verse 5, David says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity." And then the second line, "In sin my mother conceived me." Notice, I, the subject, was brought forth, verb, in iniquity. So how I was brought forth. And notice how he ends with in iniquity, but then the beginning of the next line, so we might do it this way. Notice the beginning of the next line, he says, "And in sin my mother conceived me." All right, so conceived would parallel brought forth. And then me would parallel I. And then in iniquity and sin. So notice the second line is reversed compared to the first. And that draws attention to the iniquity and the sin. This was a poetic device often used by Hebrew poets to draw attention to that hinge point, the how the first line ends and the second line begins. And David used this a lot in this particular psalm. Let's see if there's another one. Yeah, the first line, "Be gracious to me according to your loving kindness." And notice how the second line begins, "According to the greatness of your compassion." So that's a chiasm as well. All right. So that's usually, it's a special case of a synonymous or contrastive parallelism. All right. So hopefully some of this is coming back to you. So this step, we're actually in this particular step of the poetic analysis, we're examining the parallelism within each verse. And then again, this wasn't not just an academic exercise, but the intent is to identify, to see what the poet is doing, because often this parallelism will help us better understand what he is saying. How are the two lines connected together? They're very often is a connection. What kind of connection is that? Is it synonymous? Is he just sort of repeating what he had said in each line? Or is there a contrast being given? Or is the second line somehow developing the first? But there is a connection within a poem. And so we'll want to, in this step, as we're doing the poetic analysis, after we have identified the setting of the poem, after we have identified the structure and the type of poem, we then want to get more focused and look at, okay, I'm going to examine each verse within the poem and identify the parallelism that is used there. All right. And so in the Proverbs and Psalms, nearly every verse you'll see parallelism. In the other, like in the prophetic genre, sometimes it is Hebrew poetry, but parallelism is not used as much. So, but in the Psalms and Proverbs, you'll see it very extensively, quite common. All right. So in this step, that's what we're examining, is the parallelism within the poem that you're studying. All right. Now the steps to do that, as we learned in those previous sessions, is first you want to identify how many lines are contained within the verse. And as I said before, normally most Hebrew poetry is in couplets or bicola, 2 lines. Some poems contain 3 lines, a tricola, and then some, as I said, may have 4 lines or more. We called those Coca-Cola. But basically, even in those extended ones where there's more than 2 lines, there's still an interrelationship between the lines. All right. Some poems, as I note here, some poems actually have only 1 line. Like, for example, Psalm 100. The first verse is just 1 line. So there's obviously no parallelism there. Sometimes that's done just for attention or to focus a particular statement. But then notice the second line, serve Yahweh, serve the Lord with gladness. Okay, those are the 3 parts to this line. Notice come before him with joyful singing. Okay, that's synonymous. Okay, it's basically making the same statement, repeating that. All right. But then when we get to the next verse, in fact, let's look at Psalm 24 as a example of this. So sorry, let me jump back for a minute. So first you want to identify how many lines are within the verse, and then you want to identify the kind of parallelism used, and we've already went through that, reviewed that together. So, and after that, you want to look at the poem overall and see, okay, does the poet use the same kind of parallelism throughout the poem? Does he vary it? Are there sections where he uses synonymous parallelism and then uses a different kind? Sometimes these are intentional to draw specific attention to a particular statement he's making. So, for example, if most of the poem is synonymous, and then he puts in a contrastive parallelism in there, that would draw attention to that difference. And so we want to at least examine the poem as a whole and see, is there a pattern in the kind of parallelism you used? Often there's not, but sometimes there is. So you just want to pay attention to that, because we're going through all of these different features, the poetic devices, in this case, the parallelism, the structure. We're doing this because these are different ways that the poet is communicating his particular biblical truth. And so there are different ways in Hebrew poetry to give emphasis or focus or draw attention. That can be done by repetition. That can be done by exclamations, behold or whoa. Emphasis can be done by chiasms, as I said, where the second line is reversed. That draws attention to a certain feature. So there's different ways that the poet can emphasize or draw attention to something. So we need to be able to see, to understand these different poetic devices so that we can see how he does that. So that we're more accurately matching not only the meaning of the words that he uses, but also the way he communicates those particular words. Again, poetry is emotional. There's feeling. There's going to be times of emphasis, and we want to be able to see that, because we're not listening to him reading the poem, right? We're just we're reading it. So we don't have his voice that is giving us the intonation or the volume or the variations for emphasis. So what we have is the written text. And there are ways that emphasis is brought forth in that written text. And so that's why we're examining these different poetic features to understand that. Okay, so parallelism is one of those ways that communicates, that the author is able to communicate focus and emotion within the text. Any questions on this? We're going to look at Psalm 24 in a minute just to go through a quick example. But hopefully some of this is coming back to you. I know we covered it a while back. Any questions or comments? Okay, well then let's let's go to Psalm 24. I'm just going to pick a few verses out of that particular psalm as by way of review. Psalm 24. All right. So I'll do the first one with you guys and then just call on you for the next. We just got a few verses, but so Psalm 24. Again, remember the two steps are one, identify identify the number of lines, and then two is identify the types parallelism used between the lines. Okay. So again, remember parallelism is not from verse to verse, it's within the verse. We're just examining within each verse the relationship between the lines of that verse. We'll look at the connection between the verses when we do our diagram. The block diagram will show us the relationship between verses, but the parallelism shows us the relationship within each verse. So as we're looking at Psalm 24, notice it has the earth is the Lord's or Yahweh's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. So notice we have here the earth,
The world.
and the world is the Lord's. Okay, now we don't have is the Lord's in the second line. Do you remember why? You remember there's another poetic feature that sometimes the poets will use in order to shorten the poem.
Can't remember the word, Pastor, but it's assumed or it is implied.
Yeah,
That
we called that
is the loss.
Ellipsis was the word.
Yeah.
Where yes, a word or phrase may be left out of one of the lines, but is still assumed to be there. So, because otherwise, if you don't have this, right, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. Well, the world, what?
It's
What
an
about the
incomplete
world?
sentence. Yeah.
Right. So the same idea is implied. It's just he didn't state it there in order for brevity to keep the line short, because that's one feature. So is the Lord's is implied in the second line as well, even though it's not written. All right. So the earth is the Lord's, and then notice, and all it contains. And then we have, and those who dwell in it. So we see here, first, there are two lines within this verse, and the type of parallelism is synonymous. Each line is basically saying the same thing. All right. Now synonyms are used: earth and world, all it contains, those who dwell in it. Now sometimes in a synonymous, you may have a particular difference here, like all it contains likely is referring to everything on the earth. But then the second line, he has a particular focus, those who dwell in it. And in fact, if you study the Hebrew text, earth is often used as a general expression of the land, the physical land, whereas world in Hebrew, the Hebrew word for world, it's a different word, and it often refers to the inhabitants of the earth. So the second line is synonymous, but it does draw a little bit more attention to the people on the earth are the Lord's. So the first line is a little more general. The earth as a whole, everything on it is the Lord's. And then the second line, it's saying something similar, but there is a particular focus on the inhabited world, the inhabitants of the world. But we still say it's synonymous. Okay, because notice the way it's worded is very similar. The earth, the world, all it contains, those who dwell in it. So this will be a synonymous parallelism in this case. All right, does that make sense? Hopefully you guys remember.
Yeah.
Okay, Pastor Philip, I'm going to give you the second verse here. Go ahead and read it, and then let us know how many lines, and then the type of parallelism.
Sure. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. It has two lines, and I'm sure it is synonymous. And I think he has is dropped in second line.
Yes.
Ellipsis, right?
Good. Very good. Yes. So, yeah, he, and then has founded, we could say has founded it, established it, same idea, upon the seas and upon the rivers. Okay, so yeah, this is a very strong, clear, synonymous parallelism. Same subject, the verbal idea and the object are the same, founded it, established it, and then even the added phrase, where he founded it, upon the seas, where upon the rivers. So again, seas and rivers are two different kinds of bodies of water, right? The sea is like, you know, a lake, and a river is moving water, but both, it's speaking of water, so it's still, it's not the exact same word, but it's clearly the same idea. All right. And then, yes, good observation, Philip, that the he in the second line is not there written there, but it's presumed. In fact, the Hebrew verbs include the subject typically, so this is probably just the translators decided not to put the word in, but it's clearly meant to be there. Okay.
Yes.
Very good. Okay. Let's give Shulong, if you are there, could you go ahead and do verse 5?
Shulong's class just got out, so he is getting reorganized here. He'll be on in a minute.
Okay. Well, then Dwayne, you know, you're gonna fill in for him. All right. Can you do verse 5?
Oh, sure. I think it's going to do me, but he shall receive a blessing from the Lord. The righteousness from the Lord is his salvation. Oh boy, I guess it develops, huh? He shall receive a blessing, and it's righteousness from the Lord and his salvation that is the blessedness, huh?
Yeah. So it's two lines. So we want to identify that first. And then, yeah, I think you're right. It's developmental. It's there. It's not parallel because he doesn't say, well, let's think about this a minute. He shall receive a blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. So if it is developmental, what kind of these three, which one does it seem to be? Is it adding? Is it explaining, or is it giving a reason or result in the
I
second
think
one?
it's definitely expanding, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. Right? Because it's adding righteousness. He shall receive a blessing and he shall receive righteousness. So we call it expansion, sorry, or addition. So it's adding. The second line's adding more information to the first. Now, this line, some might say, well, it seems almost it might be parallel because he shall receive, you know, that seems to be right. It's implied in the second line. Then they might say, well, and a blessing, and then righteousness, and then from the Yahweh and from the God of his salvation. So some might say, well, it seems like it might be synonymous. Then you have to ask, is the blessing and righteousness meant to be the same thing? This would be an interpretive decision here. Because if it's parallel, then that would mean blessing and righteousness are supposed to be synonymous in some way. But if blessing and righteousness are distinctly different, then developmental would make more sense. that we receive a blessing and we receive righteousness. Right, so that's something you'd have to think about as far as what's going on here. Is blessing and righteousness meant to be synonymous, connected? And it could be. It's something that you want to think about. All right. But yeah, I think developmental expansion makes sense. And then I would say, you know, possibly synonymous. Need to determine if blessing and righteousness are meant to be synonymous. Okay, synonymous. That would require further study. And again, this is like with many of these steps, you know, when we do this, you may not get the right, exact, perfect answer at the beginning, right? You're going through the process of study. And so this step is just meant to make us think about it, to ask these questions. So, okay, how are these two lines related? Well, it looks like developmental. That makes sense. But perhaps righteousness and blessing, the author is using those in a synonymous way. So you need to study the whole psalm, get the context for the psalm, and look at the flow of thought, and that will help us identify which one it might be. But at least in this step, we're forced to ask the question, oh, it could be synonymous, or it could be developmental. That it's making us think now about those two words, blessing and righteousness. Are they related? So, you know, you might look up, you know, as you do a word study, and then as you look at the flow of thought in the psalm, what's the focus of the stanza? These kinds of things will help us to answer that question, whether it's synonymous or not. But this is why I think parallelism, studying it, is helpful, because it makes us ask these kinds of questions. It makes us think about that. Whereas if we didn't look at the parallelism, it may not come to our mind as much. So, you know, in studying scripture, we learn these different steps. We're going through them because it focuses us to look at the passage from different points of view, looking for different things. And that's what exposes or opens up our minds to consider the different possibilities within the passage, and really to think about that as we're studying the text. Okay, and so parallelism is one of the ways, one of the things, as we examine the poetic text, it's one of the tools that allows us to look at it from a certain way. And then when we do the block diagram, if you'll notice in this particular verse that Dwayne just did, the previous verse, verse 2, that Philip did, notice it begins with the word for. So verse 2 has a link or a connection back to verse 1. Okay, now parallelism, we don't look at that connection, but when we do the diagram, we would see that oh, the first verse is making a parallel statement, right? These two we would put together. Here, let me just do that real quick. Do it. This is a bonus feature for our class today. All right. So notice we have these two statements here in verse 1 that basically are saying the same thing. So how would we diagram it? We'd have the earth is the Lord's. Let's see. The earth and all it contains is the Lord's. All right. The world is the Lord's, and those who dwell in it. All right. Now then verse 2, we go, okay, notice that word for. So that's telling us it's connected to what he's just said. And it's giving us the reason. Why is the earth, why the earth is the Lord's? Because, or for, he founded it. He made it. So we would put for under is, because it's going to modify the verb. It's telling us, so this is how I would do it.
Yep.
It's telling us why the earth is the Lord's. All right, it's the reason. So I would connect it back to technically to the verb. All right, since it's telling us why, it's going to modify a verb. The earth is owned by the Lord because he founded it. And then upon the seas is where he founded it. So I would put that below. All right, and he established it on the river. So here, this is again parallel to the above it. So I would put it right under. It's two reasons. Again, it's really one reason. It's repeated. It's synonymous, saying the same thing. But verse 2, the relationship is, verse 2 is telling us the reason for verse 1. Verse 1's making a statement that he repeats. Basically, God owns the earth and everything on it. Why? Why can he make that assertion? Why is that true? Because God made it. He founded it, and then again, he repeats that. He established it. Okay, so the diagram shows us now the relationship between verse 2 and verse 1. But parallelism shows us the relationship within the verse. So we have synonymous parallelism in verse 1, where he repeats, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. And then again, the same idea, the world is the Lord's and all, and those who dwell in it. All right, so it's a synonymous statement. He could have just said, earth is the Lord's, for he founded it upon the seas. Okay, that's the particular meaning here. But it's not as poetic, is it? That's just a statement of fact. But what poetry comes in, the way that it now is given the aesthetic quality is by adding in these parallel statements. So now it's a more poetic expression by using the synonymous parallelism. You know, and that adds a little bit more emphasis. It adds a little more emotion, like when we repeat things. And so by doing that, within each verse, we have that parallelism that sort of, in this case, both are synonymous, which makes sense, right? He's making a statement and then giving us the reason. And then the way we see that is this, again, this connection for, because he founded it upon the sea and established it upon the rivers. That makes sense, guys? Any questions about that? So this is how, yeah, go ahead. You try.
No, go ahead. You finish first.
I'm just going to say again, this is how we see the difference between parallelism and block diagramming. This example is meant to show that. So we're looking at the passage with two different perspectives or two different things we're looking for. One, we're just looking within the verse. What's the relationship? In diagramming, we're going to look at between the verses. How are they connected together? So go ahead, Yuchai. You had a comment, question?
Yep. Now, I was going to ask two questions. One is just something that it just came as you were doing the block diagramming. Why the psalmist says he founded it upon the seas and upon the rivers? Is it because in the olden days, they look at the earth and then they saw masses of water, and the psalmist think that the earth or the ground actually sits on the water, whereas now we know it's not. You know, it's all the way ground, all the way to the core of the earth.
Yeah, so that would be a sort of interpretive question. So one could be you'd want to understand, what perhaps the the culture and the people. Another would be just think about the steps in creation, each day of creation. You remember before land
It
was
was
created,
yeah.
he separated the waters.
Yeah, yeah.
And then land was created sort of on the water, so to speak, or made distinct from. So perhaps it's going back to the creation account,
Yeah.
right? Where the land and the waters were separate, but the land came after.
Yeah.
So you might,
My,
do a study on, looking at if there are other Old Testament passages. So notice there's a couple cross references here. And that may provide some, Psalm 136, verse 6, to him who spread out the earth above the waters. Okay,
Yeah.
that seems to be looking back to creation, the creation account, right? You guys remember that, Genesis 1. Verse 6, he separated the waters, the atmosphere from the waters on the earth. Right, so that came right on the second day, as we see in, I don't know what these that didn't help getting these I don't know how to remove that. I'll have to do that another time. I'll do it here. Okay. So yeah, so day one, right, was when God created light, and then day two was when he separated the water, the atmosphere from the waters in the earth, right? And then notice the next day, dry land. So even the order of creation, this would be my first thought as I'm studying that. If I were thinking about this question, I think the first thought I'd have is perhaps would be just referring to how God created the land, and sort of right, the water was there first in a sense, and then God moved the waters around to expose the land.
Yep.
So, but it could also be, as you mentioned, Chai, perhaps there's just a mindset mentality of those in the days this was written, perhaps looked at it a certain way. I don't know. Any other ideas or thoughts, guys?
Sorry, Pastor Tim. My second question in the block diagramming of Psalm 24, verse 1 and 2, if you were to continue into verse 3 and 4, my question is that how do we track the flow of thoughts of the psalmist, in this case David, that he, in the first two verses, he actually talked about God, who is the creator, who is the owner, who is a sustainer of the earth and all that's in it. And then how his thought flow from that to the questions of who can actually be in the presence of God in verse 3 and 4.
Yeah.
If you were to follow the block diagramming that you did just now on the Word document.
Yeah, and so here you've got in verse 3, right, who may ascend. We don't have a connector word at the beginning.
Yeah, yeah.
So this seems to be an independent clause, right, a new statement. But this is the thing in poetry, and you're going to see this when we cover diagramming poems, is a lot of times that poets don't include the connector words. So the relationship between verse 3, I think we see verse 4, the relationship, right? He asked the question, right? Yeah. Who may ascend, who may rise? And then verse 4 answers it.
That's right.
Okay, so we see that relationship. But verse 3 to verses 1 and 2, is there a relationship, or is this a new thought? And so I think it's that's something we'd have to, because there's no connector word here. who, it just starts out with who. But it seems like, again, this would require studying of the whole psalm, but that perhaps the connection is because God is in this exalted place, right? He owns everything. And therefore, who is even allowed to be in his presence? Right? If he's the great creator and owner of everything, I think then the psalmist's question is because of that, right? And so the idea maybe is a therefore. So who can ascend? Who can be in his presence?
Yeah.
But again, that would just be my initial thought.
Could the sorry, what do you call it? The not subtitle, subscript. What's that? The one that just after Psalm 24. You see, because we were learning that this is part of the inspired text. It says the King of Glory. So could he be, if you move up the screen a bit to the just underneath the word Psalm 24,
Yeah.
the King of Glory. Could it be that David was looking at these verses 1 and 2 in many ways implying or describing the awesomeness of God and his glory, and then in verse 3 his thought flow to then quite a logical question: in view of such a glorious God, who can be in his presence? Then he answered himself in verse 4, and then the result of that answer is in verse 5 and 6.
Yeah, and of course you'd have to, study through the psalm in detail, but that, that could be would make sense as a flow of thought there.
Yeah.
And then, verse 7 through 10 is really just a declaration again of the glory of God and his worthiness of being praised. So that's why, the King of Glory, right?
Yeah, that's
It's repeated. So
5 times.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah, so we've got the sort of the refrain here. Verse 7 and 8 with verses 9 and 10.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, clearly the focus of the whole psalm is the glory, greatness of God. And he starts it with, he's the creator of everything. He owns everything. And so who would be worthy to even be in his presence? So it's this idea of, I think those two themes are connected together in the psalm. But the diagram, which again, we'll focus more later, you're going to see in diagramming Hebrew poetry that often the connector words, the so that's and therefores and ands and fors, and those are often not written explicitly. And so, but the idea is there. I'll show you some examples when we get to the diagramming part down the road. Here, I just wanted to really highlight the difference between looking at the parallelism and looking at the diagram, and what each of those focuses our attention on. So the parallelism, again, is within the verse. And he uses synonymous parallelism in those first 2 verses, just, I think, to highlight, to repeat the statement, God owns the earth. He made it. And then the second line is, the first line is, right, God owns the earth. And the second verse is because he made it. But the parallelism just looks within the verse. The diagram will show us then how verses are connected together. But the diagramming poetry is a little bit of challenge.
And that diagramming is very important. If we can learn and get that in our head, that solves problems.
Yes. Yeah, and I found diagramming poetry to be a little more of a challenge than epistles because of the absence of those connector words. Because again, the Hebrew language is a lot more, what's the way to, I don't know if intuitive's the right word, but like Greek is very mechanical, like everything's there, very structured. Those of you that have studied Greek, it's relatively easier to identify the words that go together just because of the grammar. In Greek, it's a lot more clear. Hebrew, it's more difficult. There's only two verb tenses in Hebrew. Greek, I think there's what, 7 or 8, I forget, something like that. But in Hebrew, there's only 2. So it's a lot more a language that you have to get a feel for from the context. And we see that in the Hebrew poetry. Like I said, in Greek, you'll have those connector words. Usually it's very explicit. But in Hebrew, especially Hebrew poetry, not always there. So you have to really understand the flow and the feel of the poem. And like Uchai just sort of did, trying to understand how these things flow together. And some of that, then it's going to be more the intuitive understanding of the poem rather than having all of the particular grammatical features present. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think we'll see that, like I said, a little more clearly when we start doing diagramming. We'll do a few examples of poems, and you'll see this. It's like there is a relationship. Like there is a relationship between verse 3 and verses 1 and 2, I think, in this psalm. But that relationship isn't given as explicitly through, a connector word, like therefore. It has to be understood by trying to follow the flow of thought from verse 1 to 2 to 3. So asking, okay, is verse 3 here, is this a new thought, a new idea, a new stanza, or is it related to what he's just said? And if so, what's that relationship? Okay. We have to do a little more thinking about that when we're looking at Hebrew poetry than we would say if we're in an epistle or a Greek text. All right, but again, we'll come back to this in more detail when we get diagramming the next step. Okay, so we looked at verse 5. Dwayne did a good job there. Then we have verse 7. Let me ask you, Chai, to do this one. Again, remember, identify the number of lines and then...
There's 3 lines.
Yeah.
And, well, you have, I'm not sure this is like, what's called it, the formal. Oh, it is not. The first 2 lines are parallel, but the third line expanded the first 2 lines.
Okay, so lines 1 and 2, you're saying is synonymous.
Synonymous, sorry, yeah.
Right? Yeah, I knew what you meant. So, right, yeah. Lift up.
Your heads.
Be lifted up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he says, "O gates, O ancient doors." Yeah. And then here he says, "Lift up your heads." And I think the second line, it's the same idea implied there. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's synonymous. It's the same idea being expressed. He uses gates in verse 7, the first line, and ancient doors in the second, but those are synonymous. Okay, so yeah, I think lines 1 and 2 are related by a synonymous parallelism, but then you have line 3.
Which
How's that
expanded, so that, in fact, with a sense of purpose, so that the King of Glory may come in.
Yes, so that is, call it developmental, right? It's developing. It's developing lines 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And what's the type of developmental? You got expansion, explanation, reason, or result?
I would think it's expansion.
So he's adding more information.
Oh no, could be the result then.
Yeah.
Thinking about
The reason, right?
that the reason. Yeah.
So that, right? The
Yeah,
King of
so that
Glory
the
may come
purpose.
in.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
So we would say line 3 gives the reason for lines 1
2.
and 2.
Correct. Thank you. Yeah.
See that? And in this case, we have a connector word that, or so that, right? That tells us why. Lift up your gates. Why? Your heads be lifted up, O ancient doors. Why? So that the King of Glory may come in. So it's really an image too, isn't it? You see
It
the
is.
image?
Yeah. And also the image, the imagery, sorry, is what's the word? Well, I'm not sure what's the word. The imagery is one that is because the King of Glory does not need to have the door open or the gates open for him to come in because he is the Lord. So what I feel, I may well be wrong here, that is the idea of even the creation worshiping the King of Glory.
Yeah, and we're going to see this is the next step actually in the poetic analysis, but is to look at the images. And the image here is, right, of the entrance to a city, right?
Yes, that's
The
right.
gate, a door, and as the king would approach the city, right, the doors would be opened, so the king would enter. And so that's the image here. Yeah, God doesn't need, he's not kept out by doors. He's omnipresent. So he's not, this isn't giving us a theological statement of, God requires us to, open up ways so he can get in. But it's just meant to, it's an image or a picture of, that presents God as like this glorious king coming into a city. And so the way that the king would be honored and welcomed would be, right, for the gates to be open, the doors to be open. And he adds a poetic feature by, he doesn't just say open the gates, he says lift up your heads, O gates. Right? That's a personification.
Of worship?
No, it's describing, right? Gates don't have heads.
Yeah, that's right. It is personification in that sense, but is it implying even the gates and the doors are worshiping?
Or that it's just, right, like I said, the picture of you have to understand the image here. What's the image? That's the gates of the city being opened to welcome the king to come in. And so the tone here is, right, King of Glory, so there's a tone of worship here, right? If you look at verse, I didn't put the whole. Who is this King of Glory? Yahweh, strong and mighty, mighty in battle. So notice that adds this idea of the victorious king entering the city. Because notice he focuses attention on God's being strong, mighty in battle. So I think that's the image here, is the king, the conquering king has returned. Welcome him, give him honor, this kind of thing.
Yep.
And then he repeats that in verses 9 and 10, just again, I think for emphasis. But so we see a lot of things happening here in this particular. So we see that personification, gates and doors don't have heads, but that's the image, right? As the gate is drawn up, right? As the gate to the city is drawn up, it's like a head lifting up, right? It's like your head bowed, and as you lift up your head, that's kind of the picture of the gate opening, right? To the city. So that's a personification, because gates don't have heads and they can't lift their own heads up, right? Someone else has to do that, but it's a personification. It's like talking to the gate, just as a poetic way to, rather than saying, soldiers, open the gates, this is a more of a poetic way when you're speaking to the gates directly, lift up your heads, O gates. So it's this idea of rise up, open, so the King of Glory may come in. And I think it's, again, it's that image of a conquering king returning from battle, victorious, because of verse 8.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, the whole tone is the idea of worship, give honor to, but I don't think it's the gates worshiping. I think it's just a picture of them, opening up so that the king would be welcomed and honored to come in. But that's that's an image being presented here by David. So he starts the psalm. The first part is right, just that God is creator. He owns everything because he made everything. And so who would be worthy even to come before this king? And then there's like this cry out, a declaration of the glory of this king with this image of a conquering king entering the city. Okay. So that really takes us to the next really step or part as we look at the poetic analysis, is identifying, the imagery in the poem and the poetic devices. So we were kind of just doing that in Psalm 24, but let's look at this, review it a little more closely. We talked about imagery early on in our study of Hebrew poetry. And if you remember, right, the imagery is really a key feature in Hebrew poetry, and that imagery. And we just saw an example of that in Psalm 24. So as you go through the poem, you want to identify what images are being presented here. All right. So for example, as we just saw in Psalm 24, the image of a conquering king entering into the city. And then what would that image have conveyed to the original audience, right? So they would have understood, right, the way the cities were designed, right? You had the walls and you had a gate, usually a large gate, probably a couple of tons, a couple thousand kilos, that would be the entrance to the city, and that would have to be raised up for people to enter into the city. If you remember, Samson, actually, one time he actually uprooted the city gates and carried them off like 100 kilometers. And these things are huge. They're heavy. Like I said, a couple thousand kilograms, and or 1,000 kilograms. I mean, and he just took off with one of these city gates. But so they would understand. The original audience would have understand that scene, that imagery. We don't have these small cities where gated anymore. A lot of our cities, right, are open. And we don't have, most cultures don't have kings anymore that would come in from a battle. So it's a little bit different. But that culture, that's how they would have understood that image. As give honor, hail the king as he comes back victorious from battle. Welcome him, let him enter that we may give him honor. So that's the image being presented. And by understanding that image, we then can understand what the poet's describing there. Is this what this picture is. So, but we want to, as we examine the poem, we want to be able to identify those images and how the original audience would have understood that image. And then what is conveyed through that. So again, like in Psalm 24, what's conveyed is this idea of giving honor, exalting God. Right? He's the one worthy of our praise. He's the one worthy of our attention, our worship, which is what is expressed in the first stanza of the poem, right? Who may ascend, right? When we talk about who may ascend the mountain of Yahweh, what do people do that for? It's speaking of the temple, right? The Temple Mount. So who may go up there? Who is worthy to be in his presence? And the idea is to give him worship. Right? That's why you would go to the temple. All right, so that's the picture of the whole poem, really, or the idea of the poem. So what's conveyed in verses 7 to 10 is this image. The image is intended to promote, encourage, focus on God being worthy of worship and honor and exaltation, just like, a conquering king, mighty king. All right. Let's take a look at the psalm right before it, which is a well-known, probably one of the most well-known psalms, Psalm 23. Pastor Philip, I'm going to ask you to read this psalm, and then let's see if we can identify the images within this particular psalm.
So
Can you read it
the
okay?
sum of yes,
Okay.
yeah. Yahweh is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and loving kindness will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of Yahweh forever.
Great. Okay, maybe Pastor Philip, we'll start with you. What image or images do you see here? What picture, at least we could start with the first few verses. What picture is being described there?
So Yahweh as my shepherd.
Yeah, he makes that statement in verse 1. Yahweh, or the Lord, is my shepherd. I shall have no needs. I shall not want. So he makes a statement, and then he presents sort of a picture. What's that picture or image?
So that means sheep. Am I right?
Right. Makes me lie down in green pastures. So yeah, it seems like the shepherd guiding the sheep, right?
Yes.
Yeah, you got to be a herdsman to understand this. And I herded cattle and hogs and things, and so it excites me because it's just, it's such sweet and comforting and energizing imagery here of leading your well, I suppose the animals that you love and that you've birthed and that you have raised and feed, and they're just part of your life. And there's a relationship between the shepherd and these lovely sheep. And of course, sheep are really lovable. Now, this is another thing, but sheep are just the most lovable and wonderful things to work with. But yeah, it's a herdsman affair here.
Yeah, right. This picture, right, of a very serene, peaceful, comforting, right, that the sheep being, or me like a sheep being brought into a place of where there's pastures and water, that he's refreshing me, guiding me. Right. But this is all sort of this image of a shepherd leading his sheep to a very safe and nurturing, comforting, providing meadow. Right. So it's really these first three verses just kind of present that scene. But then in verse 4, there's a shift in the image, isn't there? We're no longer in this serene, peaceful valley or meadow, are we? It's another kind of valley that he's describing here. Another kind of location that he's describing here. So there are those times, right, where it brings us into these peaceful, comforting, abundant places. But then there are times where it's not that way. Notice the image here is he's still with me, isn't he? You see that?
You
kind
are
of
with me. Yes.
Yeah.
The sheep are safe.
Sorry?
The sheep are safe.
Yes, exactly. Right. So really verses 1 to 4 almost go together in the sense of the picture of the shepherd bringing the sheep to a place of peace and comfort, provision, water, and pasture. And then those times where we're not in such a nice place, we're in a dangerous valley, but he's also with us, protecting us, right, with his staff. Okay, so that really verses 1 to 4, 2 to 4, presenting this image of the shepherd guiding the sheep. But then notice verse 5, there's a shift, isn't there? It's no longer a sheep and a shepherd. It's a different picture.
So verse 5 is like a banquet. Person or honorable person, exalted person or important person.
Yes. That anointed my head with oil, right? That kind of that's a usually you would do that with a king.
But that's what the shepherd does to his sheep right there. He takes real good care of them because they are always having pain and accidents.
Yeah, there's also that healing element as well. And I think here, notice that this table is kind of a different image that's communicating the same idea, but in a different way. Right? The whole psalm is really about, like Dwayne just said, God's care, his provision, his protection, his presence, like a shepherd with his sheep. But then verse 5, in order to convey this idea of protection and security and care, he gives a different image, of a table, a banquet almost, where the enemies are there, but he's being exalted in their presence. So that's just kind of, it's important to see the shift in image, but it's the same, it's still part of the same theme or idea of the psalm, the point of the psalm, but just he's using a different image to present that. You guys see that? So we're trying to understand. Go ahead, Dwayne.
And blessed sheep. Yeah, blessed sheep. I tell you, we need to appreciate our good shepherd because he is absolutely faithful. Yeah, his grace is sufficient, and we're safe right to the end.
Yeah. And
Talk about a hurt.
This psalm really is presents that in a really wonderful way. And I even, of course, if you're going through it, I'm probably sure you guys have used this. It's very common in funerals. Psalm 23 is mentioned a lot, so that's a good one to have in preparation to use at a funeral, because people are familiar with it, at least here in the States. I don't know. Is it true also in Malaysia, Myanmar, that Psalm 23 is connected to funerals or memorials?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there an element of personification? I mean, from verse 5 and 6.
Where would you see that personification?
I mean, you prepare a table for me before me. I mean, talking about, I mean, from the sheep imagery, the first 4 verses. I mean, you don't prepare a table for the sheep. I mean, the sheep doesn't sit at the table to feast. So there is, I mean, I'm wondering whether there's a element of personification where now I'm being taken care of, you know, in the presence of my enemies. There's anointing and so on.
Yeah, I think it's just the image here. I don't know if there's any personification in this particular verse, because again, personification is to apply a human characteristic to a non-human object, like before. Lift
Yeah.
up your heads, O gates. Well, gates don't have heads and don't lift themselves up. So here would be more just another image being given to convey the theme of the psalm. God not only cares for me, not only protects me, but also, exalts me for my enemies, provides for me.
Yeah, I think
feeds me and so on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Our backgrounds, what we have experienced in the past have a lot. We don't rise above our culture or our environment much. And if you've grown up as a herdsman and the work it is to take care of these beloved sheep, and a herdsman loves his sheep. He's birthed them, he's raised them, and he knows them. He has names. It's a relationship. And of course, if you never have been in that situation, it'd be kind of difficult to see. But
yeah.
Oh my, I'm just carried away with this thing because, oh man, that takes me back to my roots. And it's well, the whole Bible has got a lot of agrarian, is that the agriculture, that type of thing. And yeah, I know the church in Singapore found out a lot about farming. I talked about farming all the time, and that's what I know, and here you got it. And it's I can identify, and it's what a comfort that we have a God that is a good shepherd. He is beyond expression. And he'll take care of us, and Myanmar now really needs that kind of security and that kind of comfort. Yeah, and now with all the economic upbeat, boys, things ever bellying up here economically now. The pandemic shut lockdown is really hitting now, and of course with this multi-billion-dollar scam that has hit with the OMNO. That, of course, is still being exposed. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There is just so much corruption around it. It's rather unnerving, but we have a good shepherd. He knows what he's doing, and it's all under control, and it's going somewhere, and he's about to appear on the horizon. What a comfort that is to have our good shepherd prepared to now break into this and get it all straightened out. I tell you what wonderful days we live in. What a privilege it is to see these things happen. The whole world is now in an uproar. These are becoming more and more and more desperate days. And the secular people even say, well, where is this thing going? But when I hear my kids in the States, they continue on just like nothing's happening. I just don't identify with that environment. Here it's happening. We don't have I suppose the resources to, I suppose, comfort ourselves. But they're like in Myanmar, the resources are not there, and we see it, we feel it. And with this business of the drug dealers coming in all at once here, that's and we have a great big new mosque going up right near us here. It's a huge old thing. And the Islamic State and all these Hezbollah, they're all here. What they do, they just arrested a whole bunch of the Islamists just lately here in Malaysia. It was in the news today. I don't know how many there was they arrested. They're real extremists. Yeah. And they're terrorists. And even the government here is afraid of them. And they won't even let a Jewish ship even dock at a port here. Did you see all that? This is really interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, a psalm like this is definitely, especially in places like that, or even, I go to Pakistan, of course, and even now in Myanmar, right, with all the turmoil, this psalm is really important. And I think you brought up a great point, Dwayne, about just if you have these experiences, if you raise sheep or cattle or livestock, you kind of identify even more with the psalm here.
Emotional. And you can get emotional.
That's right.
And walk away from a lot of pets, a lot of beloved animals. I had to walk away. And Petunia, my pet hog, I tell you, I miss her. She was such a loving pig. Oh, I tell you. Pigs are more like people than any other animal on the farm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the little piglets are so lovable. And I had dozens of them. And cows, they're well, cows can be pretty, hard to get along with. But each animal has its personality. You get to know them.
But that's the thing when you see these images, is trying to, again, look at it through the eyes of the people in David's day, and like Dwayne said, there's a lot more agrarian agricultural focus there in that time and in that place. And so they would really pick up on sort of the emotional part of the images presented here. And so we really want to understand the image, but also how would that image have impacted or affected the original audience? How would they have perceived or understood that image? That's what's important. Not today, right? A lot of us live in cities, may have never stepped on a farm, never raised sheep or cattle. We just eat them. Okay. But we may not have that. So we might not have hopefully you didn't eat Petunia, but it happens.
Yeah, David was a herdsman. He was a shepherd.
Yeah. And so
that in it.
The better we can identify, understand how would the original audience have understood that picture. That's what you're after. All right. Because then you have to explain that to your hearers, when you're going through the passage, and convey that same tone of comfort, security, care, that personal connection. You may have to use other ways to illustrate that in your context, but our goal when we're looking at these images is to first see the image, but then also understand the impact of that image on the original audience. How would the original hearers have received that, understood that image? So as Dwayne was explaining, like he had that background, so there's there is a little more of a connection to what the emotion of the passage because of that experience. So that's what, as you're studying it, that's what you're trying to get to as well, is the, not just the image, but what is the effect or meaning or impact of that image from the original hearers, because that's the thing we need to express to our hearers as we're teaching or preaching that particular passage. And so this is the challenge, especially in the Old Testament, is trying to grasp the culture and the impact and the understanding of people in that day. Because we remember first that passage was written, this poem was first written, you know, to that audience, not to us. So we want to take, how would that first audience have received this image, and then try to explain or convey that to our culture. So if you're living in a city, you know, it may have a different, you may have to talk about, you know, pets, you know, pet dog or cat or something, you know, try to make connections in that way. Even though it's different, it's not exactly the same, but you're going to try to make connections with your hearers so that they would have receive the same sort of emotional impact that the image would have had on the original hearers. Does that make sense? You guys?
I feel sorry for you guys that never farmed. You missed the better things in life. We always had about, you know, 5 or 6 dogs and 30 cats, and we had rabbits, honeybees. I had honeybees. Oh, I tell you, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
I miss it. I'd like to get back to it, but I have to be realistic. Like my mom used to say, Dwayne, act your age. And so I've got to remind myself all the time.
You're still young at heart, brother.
Well, I'm still pumping. Thankful for that.
Amen. Well, hey, we're going to need, sorry, go ahead.
No. Yeah, well, this is getting late. I'm getting tired.
Yeah, we're going to need to finish up here. We'll take a look at the rest of the steps next week, Lord willing. But
very interesting.
Yeah, so this is, I think, as you dig into, I love looking at Hebrew poetry. I think it's so rich. There's so much to it, but we have to, you know, again, like every other part of Scripture, you have to bridge from where we are here back to that time and place, and that's the challenge. But once you can get there, wow, it really opens up, giving us a greater understanding. And again, even like in poetry, that emotional impact as well, which is what poetry is able to bring or convey. So that's what we're trying to find, identify, understand as we're doing that. So, all right. So next week we'll pick up again. We'll look at the other poetic devices and go from there. Okay. It's good to see Fu Wei is now in the light. I noticed earlier you were in the darkness. So Fu Wei, can you close us in prayer tonight?
All right.